Morning, everybody, as you're coming onto the webinar.
Morning, welcome.
Well, I think the numbers are starting to slow down a little bit, Jerry. Shall we get started?
Yep, we'll make a start, yep.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's webinar. My name's Liz May. I'm the CEO of ShopCare. ShopCare is a health and safety association. We cover retail, supply chain, manufacturing and transport. And we're thrilled this morning to welcome Olivia Lund, who's a partner at Duncan Cottrell. Olivia is going to be talking about some very hot topics this morning. So I'll hand over to Jerry Lynch, who's the chair of ShopCare.
Thank you, Liz. Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. So this week we're really going to be focusing more on the legal side of things versus last week. The working from home and also entering back into the office, and also things like vaccination, obviously key topics on people's minds. As per last week, if you've got any questions, please raise them in the chat box. If you see someone else's question you like, you can like it, and that will raise it to the top of the agenda. So yeah, so before anything else, I'd just like to introduce Olivia Lund, as Liz said, a partner at Duncan Cottrell. So Olivia's worked on many complex workplace incidents and fatalities, serious harm across a range of industries, defended at least 75 PCBUs in WorkSafe investigations and prosecutions. And she's also, according to NZ Lawyer 2021, recognised as a rising star in New Zealand. So very pleased to have Olivia with us. So, welcome, Olivia.
Thanks, Jerry. Hi, everyone.
So before we get into the questions, I wanted to get people on their toes with a poll. And this is really around people who have people working from home, which is probably most of you, to understand whether you've done a risk assessment on people working from home. So if you're able to put that poll up, Liz, and people are able to vote quickly on that one. So, you know, so for employees working at home, do you currently have or have done a risk assessment? So we'll see how that's going. So where we've got 24. So around half don't, around a third do, and then about 16% have done one and have taken no action based on the risk assessment. So yeah, so a third have done a risk assessment and have addressed any risks. So so yeah, thank you, everyone. So so first question for you, Olivia, is just around, you know, people's legal responsibilities as an employer. So you're thrown into having people working from home. What is their legal responsibility in terms of looking after them at home, you know, in general?
Yeah. So generally, obviously, PCBUs have that primary duty of care to ensure their workers aren't exposed to risks from their work. And that extends from both the usual work site or the office to if they are working from home. So the same approach as you would take in terms of risks that workers are exposed to, say, in an office environment or another workplace, should be followed really for work that is being carried out at home. The only difference is that employers or PCBUs don't have the same level of control over the risks at home as they would otherwise have when they're in control of the workplace. So they might not have the same level of control, but they still definitely have influence as to what is happening in that employee's or that worker's home environment. So strictly speaking, the same rules apply. So risk assessments should be being carried out for work that is being undertaken at home, but what that looks like in practice will change according to the circumstances, and what's reasonably practical, the level as to what is required will change in terms of the pandemic. So if you're at alert level 4 and you've been thrust at home and you haven't had time to prepare as you otherwise would, well, then the obligations on the employer are going to be less than if you had someone who was permanently, regularly working from home and you're not operating under this kind of urgent pandemic situation.
So now we've had a year and a half to get used to this. You know, so if employers, if there are risks that people have highlighted either in workstation or you know, their setup, their screen, so who's responsible for paying for that?
Yeah, so, well, the responsibility is both on in terms of the employee. So the workers have obligations under HASWA to make sure that they are not harmed by the work that they're doing, but also the employer. So there is a varied response and difference of opinion as to legally where the responsibility lies. If an employee is required and directed to work from home by the employer, and we put aside the pandemic for a moment, and I would say that the employer is legally obligated to provide them with sufficient tools to work from home, just like you are in you know, a usual work situation. So you would say that the employer would be obligated in that situation to either provide an allowance or cover the regional costs for a home work setup.
Right.
When we're in this pandemic situation, it's not as clear, because it's, well, who is responsible for the requirement or the direction from work from home? That's under government direction. And so we get into this grey employment law territory where it's probably a mutual obligation, and it will differ according to the position that the employer wants to take. And there'll be different options available depending on the circumstances. So we get grey in terms of, one, can they work from home or not? Yes or no. Do they have sufficient tools to do that? Yes or no. If no, well, then if the employer wants them to work from home, even if there's not a strict legal requirement to provide those tools, obviously there's reasons why they should do that in terms of providing laptops and you know, other means, a chair and a desk, if that employee can't access that. Okay,
so once we came out of the pandemic, you know, from what I'm hearing there is if the employer instructs people to work from home, then they do have a responsibility to contribute or pay for some of that. If it's the employee's choice and the employer is quite happy for them to work for the office, then there's obviously, it's more on the employee, or you know, they come to a mutual understanding between them.
Yeah, there would need to be an agreement there as to where those costs fall and who's responsible. But it's a hardline approach. If the employee is directed and required to work from home, then I think it would be reasonable for that employee to say, well, you need to make allowances or cover the costs of me working from home, and have agreement as to what that looks like. And we are now starting to see that, where weekly allowances are being provided for permanent employees who work from home to cover, you know, increased electricity costs or telecommunications, and then a lump sum amount is given for home office setup costs. Right.
Okay. The other question is, what if there's an accident at home? Who's, you know, so something happens to the employee during their normal working hours. Normally at work, the employer would be doing the investigation. Obviously, it's a little bit difficult to do that when someone's at home. Again, what's the responsibility of the employer there?
Yeah, so you would want to determine whether, well, one, I think you need to ask the question, did it happen during work time or work hours? And that the boundaries around that are blurred as well. But say if they were having a break, and tripped and fell over in their kitchen or what have you while they were making a cup of tea, yes, that might be something that the employer wants to know about, but the actual legal risk of being held liable for that would be very low, because you don't have control as a PCBU as to the wider area in terms of where that employee is going. I think you would probably limit it to the workstation setup, the immediate area around that in terms of electrical equipment and that sort of thing, and giving guidance around how they can manage that and minimise the risks associated with that. And then obviously the other psychosocial risks involved, so the isolation, lone working, job design, workload, those are other factors that cause harm, not physical harm, but mental harm that the employer should be focused on. Other things around the house, you don't have control and influence over that, and I think you'd be in a strong position to say that's not something reasonably practical that I am responsible for in terms of the PCBU and managing that risk.
Okay, so going on, taking that point of mental harm and burnout for people, because people are at home now, there is a danger that hours are getting blurred. So it's either the employee wants to start earlier, finish earlier, or whatever. If that continues, is there a need to change the employment contract to reflect that?
Yeah, in terms of varying the terms and conditions. So if it was a temporary variation, and again, we're dealing in circumstances of PMIT, you might agree a short-term variation that could be verbal, and you would confirm it in writing ideally. If it was a long-term change to the way that employee was operating, we would advise a variation and consent process, obviously, to be implemented to deal with that.
Okay, and if there's instances of, and have heard of instances of people where they're overworked or they're getting requests outside of work hours on a regular basis. Again, what's the responsibility from a good employer around managing some of that in terms of some of that risk of mental harm caused by work?
Yeah, so I think to start with, there needs to be a clear agreement or understanding between the parties and expectations as to what are the working hours, and the working hours might need to vary for each individual if they've got childcare responsibilities or they're managing it with some other household members. So the hours might vary, and so then you're getting into a situation where working hours, if you're a manager across the team, you could have employees working from, God knows, 4, 6 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock at night. And so for the manager, how they're dealing with that. So looking at ways as to, well, how can you manage workload? What are the expectations for the employee as to when they're on and when they're off? Clear communication amongst the team and other staff as to when you can contact them and when you can't. It is really hard though, because I think work is starting to spill over the sides in terms of normal working hours. If we just say 9 to 5, people feel like they're not being able to do as much as they can with the other things they're managing. So it extends past that. It is that fear. How can you manage that and reduce the risks that associate with that? Do you actually lower the hours that you expect your staff to work on a temporary basis to allow for the situation that we're in? DC, we've looked at that for our Auckland staff, and we have, billable targets that we require our staff to work, and so we've reduced those targets for our Auckland staff on the basis we know that that is a factor that is impacting on their mental health. So all of those things should be looked at.
Yeah. Okay. One of the things I've heard about overseas, I haven't heard of anyone in New Zealand doing this, is employers monitoring employees,
activity
at,
digital,
during work hours. Is that legal and ethical, I suppose? And what's your view around that?
I'm not sure. Well, if you're on your employer's IT system and cloud-based, they can monitor what you do at any time. So there's probably no issues there. Ethically and morally, whether that is a good thing to do, hopefully the answer is an obvious one. To most people, I would say no, it would actually drive really bad behaviour and probably produce a worse outcome. You're obviously monitoring your staff because you don't trust them and you want to increase productivity, but it's probably likely to have the reverse effect, where your employees don't trust you and they're not loyal or productive. And
yeah, okay. The other example I've heard about is obviously moving back to as we get back to the office. Obviously not in Auckland, but you're in Wellington, so you do have that option. I've heard of an example of someone who's been working at home, obviously full time for the pandemic, and they're a receptionist, and they're trying to negotiate staying at home or working more at home when the employer is saying, actually, I need the person physically there to deal with couriers, etc. So, and the employer's feeling a bit stressed and under pressure with the person, not wanting to come back to the office. So in situations like that where someone is actually physically needed, what's the approach an employer should take?
Yeah, so, and this is why it's important for PCBUs and employers to look at the actual role and what work is required to be performed by that worker, and not have a blanket approach because it doesn't fit for everyone. So in terms of the whole receptionist example, they are probably unlikely to be able to work from home to perform the duties. And so it would be reasonable for the employer to require them to work in the office to carry out their duties. The only grounds upon which that receptionist might be able to say, well, I'm not coming into work, is for health and safety reasons. If they've got a genuine and legitimate concern that their health and safety is not being managed appropriately by their employer, they might be able to say no for that. And so then the employer would need to say, well, we've done a risk assessment, we've got effective controls in place, and our position is justified. So ultimately, if they are allowed to, under alert level 2 and to be working in the office, and they're required to do that to perform their duties, well, then that's required. And if they refuse to, it would become an employment issue. So you would go through a usual disciplinary process and consultation piece. And if you can't get agreement, then it may end up in termination of their role.
Right, okay. All right, so moving on to vaccinations, we'll have a bit of a poll now. So I've put a poll around just understanding what people's views are in terms of mandatory vaccinations or leaving it to the individual. So Liz, if you're able to put the third poll up. We missed out poll 2, just so you know. So what's your organisation's stance on vaccination? So either everyone's encouraged to get vaccination, but no enforcement, some enforcement around high risk assessed areas, full vaccination enforcement of all staff, or full vaccination enforcement of all staff and contractors that have to work on the premises. So it's looking like most people are encouraging everyone to get vaccinated, with a few, 17%, for some enforcement of vaccinations around high risk assessed areas, and a handful for staff and contractors, but majority, it's around everyone being encouraged. Okay, so just talking about the vaccination. So do you want to talk about what what you see as a good process for if companies were thinking about or not sure about how they go about assessing, whether to enforce for just certain areas, whether to enforce for everyone that's coming onto the site. What's a good process to go through for that?
Yes, so just to kind of step back, obviously the question around mandatory vaccination, if it is, and we're talking about you can't force a person to be vaccinated, but you can require a role to be performed by a vaccinated worker. So that's the question you should be asking is, should the role be performed by a vaccinated worker? We've got obviously the vaccinations order, which is government mandated, which now has been extended to cover healthcare and education and prisons. We're still to see the order amended to cover that, but that will capture a large portion of the workforce as well as the MIQ and aircraft and border workers as well. So if you don't fall under that vaccinations order, the only way that you can enforce or require a role to be performed by a vaccinated worker is if you have conducted a risk assessment and that justifies for health and safety reasons that role should be performed by a fully vaccinated worker. So what we're seeing quite a lot of organisations do before they undertake or at the same time as undertaking a risk assessment is they're actually surveying their workforce to see where the issues might sit, and that's being done on an anonymous basis, and it's quite easy. SurveyMonkey and those sorts of tools can be used, but questions around, are you comfortable disclosing your vaccination status to us? If you are you fully vaccinated, partially vaccinated? Do you intend to be vaccinated or not? Asking the workers around, do they have concerns? If unvaccinated workers are in the office, do they want the organisation to restrict access to only vaccinated workers, both customers and clients and that sort of thing? So kind of canvassing, what does it look like for our workforce? And then also polling on other issues around, this is a consulting and engagement piece as to, are they comfortable with the current measures in place in terms of physical distancing? Is there sufficient PPE? All of those sorts of things, and then using that as a tool as kind of a mandate of the workforce to see where you sit on the spectrum. And we've done that within Duncan Cotterill ourselves, which has actually proved quite a useful tool to know, what does it look like for us? How many people actually, because you can kind of speculate and assume it might be this, and actually it's not. So it provides that reassurance that there might actually only be a handful of people who are unvaccinated, and they might have legitimate reasons not to be, that you then need to deal with on an exceptions basis, but actually the majority of your workforce will be fully vaccinated. So if you then go down that path, it's not such a big deal, and the risk of being challenged isn't as great as what you might otherwise think. So that would be my first suggestion: surveying, engaging and consulting with the workforce on a general basis. So you can't kind of go into a team meeting and say, put your hand up if you're vaccinated. That would breach
what's the issues from a privacy point of view around information?
So that's a common question. Can you ask someone about their vaccination status? So yes, you can, but they don't have to answer you, and you should only really be asking that question if you need to know for health and safety reasons. So it needs to be linked to a risk assessment. If your risk assessment determines that actually the role that's being performed doesn't need to be performed by a vaccinated worker, then asking that worker whether they're vaccinated or not is unlikely to be justified. Whereas if you've got to the point of identifying roles, and you might have categories of workers within your organisation that the risk is higher and lower for, you might be justified asking one set of workers what their vaccination status is to determine, well, what's our policy position going to be on vaccinations and what other controls do we need, versus someone who's in a lower risk role. You might not actually be justified in asking.
Right, okay. So in terms of that risk assessment, do you want, you've supplied a chart, so I'll share that. So if you want to walk people through that, and I'll just put it on screen share. So hopefully people can see that now. Is that, can you see that?
I can't, but I'm not sure if I'm on a different view than.
No, I can't see it, Jerry.
You can't see it. I'm sharing my screen, so why isn't it working? Let's try something else.
Is it maybe because I'm Spotlight?
Oh no, there we go. I can see it now, Jerry.
All right, I'll just put it in presentation mode so it's bigger. There we go. Is that?
Yep.
Yep. Okay, cool.
Cool. So I've prepared this chart, and it's not exhaustive, obviously, but it's been quite a useful tool to get our clients thinking around the issues that they need to in terms of determining whether a role should be performed by a vaccinated worker. So the first question on the left-hand side of that chart is the work covered by the vaccinations order? And so obviously if the answer to that is yes, well then the role must be performed by a vaccinated worker. And so just on that piece, you still need to consult and go through a process with your workforce around whether that role is covered by the vaccination order or not. So the first question that an organisation needs to do and determine is, one, which roles are covered by the order and which aren't. They then need to consult with the workforce to make sure that the roles that they have determined are covered are correct in terms of their decision making. And then you go through a process with the workforce as to compliance with that order and what it looks like for all of those workers. If they don't comply with the requirements of the role, what alternatives are available. If they don't disclose their vaccination status, what that will mean for them. And so the position is, if someone is required to disclose whether they're vaccinated or not, either under an order or as part of a risk assessment, and they refuse to disclose that, then you can deem them to be unvaccinated. But you need to make sure that they are advised as to, well, that that's what's going to happen, and then potentially what the ramifications or consequences of that could be if they are deemed to be unvaccinated. So that should hopefully be an easier path, obviously, for organisations to go down. We have had the vaccinations order challenged, both in the Employment Relations Authority and now the High Court, and they have upheld the position by the employers in those cases. So we've had a decision of Customs, I can't remember the other one that's just come out, that was appealed, and a High Court judicial review was taken on that case as well. And so they are coming down on side of the favour of the employer in terms of, as long as you've looked at alternatives, are there any other redeployment options? If not, and you've consulted with your workforce under that order, then termination would be justified. So if you don't fall under the order, you then go across to the first question. And obviously in Auckland, the answer to this question is yes. You know, are there COVID-19 cases in the community where the work is carried out? So why I've put that there is because there are other places, obviously, where COVID is not present, you know, Christchurch and that sort of thing, where the risk of actual exposure to COVID would be very low. And so if you were carrying out a risk assessment right now in a place of work where there is no community cases of COVID, you're unlikely to be able to justify it. Saying that, though, what we are seeing is lots of organisations planning ahead, and we've seen the government change their approach. We're no longer looking at elimination as a strategy. We're going to mitigation and minimisation. So eventually, a realistic employer will be looking ahead 3 or 6 months. It's likely we're going to have COVID throughout New Zealand, and so we're all going to have to be dealing with this issue as to, well, there are cases, so exposure is possible. So if you move down that first part of the risk assessment, so there's two parts of the risk assessment. One, the likelihood of exposure. So how likely is someone performing that role to be exposed to COVID? And then secondly, if they are exposed, what are the consequences of that? And so just focusing on that likelihood of exposure, the key focus there is one, well, is the work performed indoors or not? And then do one of those three examples. And there's more I'll talk about because WorkSafe has released further guidance since this chart has been prepared. But one is the work indoors, and two, is it high occupancy, or does the person come into contact with a high number of people? Is it crowded? Is it poorly ventilated? Or thirdly, are people in close contact? So they're working in close proximity to each other of less than a metre for long periods of time. So if you've got indoors and one of those factors, then your likelihood to exposure is probably going to be high. The other factors that WorkSafe has said that you should look at in terms of likelihood of exposure and potentially consequences are the exposures. So the high number of people that workers are coming into contact with, are they known contacts or unknown contacts? So if you've got a large workforce, say in an office, and it is actually crowded, you might have 100 people on the floor, they're all known contacts. And so it's easier to manage that in terms of the PCBU. Whereas if you're, say, an essential worker and you're dealing with large numbers of public, they are unknown contacts. And so the ability to kind of control the exposure and manage that is less. So that increases the risk there. So if you answer yes, the likelihood of exposure is high, then you move down to, well, what are the consequences of that? And so the question you can ask yourself to determining whether there is high consequence of exposure is looking at, well, does the worker performing that role come into regular contact with someone who's high risk? And high risk is, or vulnerable people are defined by the Ministry of Health. And so that's not only members of the public or clients or customers, but it's also others within the workforce as well. So when I talked earlier about surveying the workforce, one of the questions we also asked is do you have underlying medical conditions, or are you considered high risk by the ministry, or does anyone within your household bubble, are they considered high risk and vulnerable by the ministry? And so that would be kind of how far you look at, well, if your worker was exposed to COVID, who may they then be exposed to, and what would the consequences of that be? So it's both workers who are high risk, but also customers and public and clients and that sort of thing who you're working with who may be high risk. So at the moment, the ministry has defined those 4 bullet points: persons over 70, people in aged care facilities, pregnant, recently pregnant people, underlying medical conditions. What they haven't said at the moment, which I think is actually a valid consideration, which I haven't included there, is actually unvaccinated sections of society. And so I think that's why we've seen the education space, particularly early childhood education, where you've got 0 to 12 at the moment year olds, they are unvaccinated and they can't be vaccinated. So in my opinion, they are a vulnerable high risk sector within our society that are at higher risk. And so we may see them being included. So if you answer the question yes to both of those, then the role should be performed by a vaccinated worker. And where I've got out.
Can I just clarify one thing you talked about? So if a worker has someone at home, a partner, or so they're not at high risk themselves, but they may have someone in their home that's deemed at high risk. Is that taken into account? Did you say that's taken into account or not?
Yeah, so obviously it's not direct risk, but I think it is something that you should consider. So the worker themselves doesn't have regular contact with, say, another worker's household member. So we're getting kind of 2 steps of separation. But if that worker in their household has vulnerable people, say a partner or a child, and they are at high likelihood of being exposed themselves, then you may justify that role being performed by a vaccinated worker. So it becomes an objective and subjective as well.
Right, okay. And in terms of contractors and people coming onto the site, the same assessment is used?
Yeah, it becomes more difficult because then you're having discussions around vulnerability and high risk, and you might not necessarily have that information to make that judgment. And so how far you go, you may have shared working spaces where you've got multiple PCBUs that are using, say, shared toilet facilities. And so the CCC obligation under HASWA, consult, coordinate, cooperate, that is a shared area where really both organisations should be having a discussion around, well, what are the risks here? How are we going to control it? Do you have a portion of your working population that are vulnerable or high risk that we need to know about, that our workers potentially could come into contact with and expose those people who may, for medical reasons, not be vaccinated. So they are questions that should be considered, and we're all going to have to start to deal with and grapple.
So if when you're thinking about doing that survey, if you have regular contractors, let's say an IT company that regularly comes onto your site,
yeah,
would it be a good idea to include those in some of those surveys? So,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Cool. So we'll make we'll make this available after the in about a week's time, I think, once we've got the recording out. There's one question that's come up in the Q&A, which is around, does this risk assessment have to be done, is an internal risk assessment robust enough, or does it have to be done externally?
That's a good question, and it applies in not only this situation as well. If the organisation is capable and competent to carry out the risk assessment, then they can do that. Some organisations might not have the skill set to do that properly, and actually it would be wise for them to get external advice to do that. HASANS, the Health and Safety Association, have quite a good tool on their website where you can go to, and they have various professions where they list how they can help you: occupational hygienists, nurses, generalists. So I'd encourage people, if they want specific help, they can go to that website and look at what each practitioner and professional can provide assistance if there's a gap there in expertise. Okay.
Another question that's come up is, can a site simply require all visitors, i.e. contractors, temp labour, to be vaccinated as a prerequisite for entry?
Yeah, so what we're starting to see is restriction of access, and you can do that, but you need to be careful that you don't discriminate. So someone who is supplying or providing services needs to make sure that they don't discriminate on the basis of, say, medical or disability or religious beliefs. So there still needs to be an exceptions-based policy approach. But what we are seeing is lots of organisations, they have the ability to control who accesses their worksite, and they're making that a condition of access as a minimisation tool. And it couldn't be a blanket rule. Just following on from that, if there is a valid exception in terms of, say, someone who needs to come into site to access your services, and they have a valid reason, say religious or medical belief, you've got a requirement to make reasonable accommodations under the Human Rights Act for that, but only to the extent that they don't unreasonably disrupt your business or operation. So the same rule applies for employees and workers as well. If they have a genuine medical reason and they've got a GP saying that it would be inappropriate for them to be vaccinated, you can't force them. And then you need to look at, well, can we make reasonable accommodations for them to carry on working? Same goes for customers or anyone wanting to access your services. But ultimately, if you can't accommodate them, then you may be justified restricting access on that basis.
Okay. Is there a difference seen in terms of, so if I come in and I say, you know, my religious belief is I don't believe in the vaccine, versus a medical, you know, backed, you know, I'm vulnerable and my doctor can, you know, is there any distinction between the two?
Well, we've got no legal authority on that yet. Looking at it overseas, I would say the medical exemption is probably going to be given more weight than religious belief. That is the exception we're seeing most jurisdictions provide for, whereas religious not so much. It still is a protected ground under our Human Rights Act. So you would need to be mindful that you are not discriminating. But as I said, the reasonable accommodation exception is not as onerous as, say, the medical exemption for religious beliefs.
Okay, all right. Another question is, if the outcome of the general survey is that team are uncomfortable with unvaccinated teammates, what do you do then?
Yeah, so that's a tricky situation because you've got to maintain the privacy of those individuals who are choosing to be unvaccinated for whatever reason, and you would need their consent to disclose that to others. And so workers may not know who's vaccinated or who's not vaccinated. But I think in reality, what is going to happen is if you have a small portion of your workforce that is unvaccinated and you're not in a situation where you can require the role that they are performing to be carried out by a vaccinated worker, you're going to have to look at other control measures to then minimise the risk that those unvaccinated workers pose to others. And so it may be looking at implementing a testing regime, so they may be required to produce negative tests before they can access the site. That would be a legitimate tool that you could use to mitigate and control that risk. But it would also be looking at work design, layout, you know, where are they in the office? Do you put them somewhere where they are less exposed to others, or they're not working next to someone who's vulnerable? And so it's the competing situation as to whose rights trump the other, because you may have a vulnerable staff member who, for legitimate medical reasons, can't be vaccinated, and they don't want to be seated next to someone who is unvaccinated because they're more likely to contract COVID and pass it on to them. So it's legitimate information that they'll want to know, and you'll have to manage. So it's very tricky, but I think in practice, actually, it will be difficult to maintain privacy, and you can breach someone's privacy if you've got a genuine health and safety reason.
All right. Okay. And can people refuse testing? You know, so is that, you know, valid again?
Yeah, so it's similar. What most employment lawyers are saying is the testing regime will be similar for probably drug and alcohol testing. And we look to overseas jurisdictions, they're far ahead of us in terms of that game and the rapid antigen testing. And, you know, I'm aware of the UK that they require fully vaccinated workers. They only allow fully vaccinated workers in the office and a negative COVID test on the day. So it's a situation of where, you know, you're getting up, brushing your teeth, doing your test before you go into the office or the work site. So we may end up there. We're not there yet. Testing will probably be a tool that I think, and we see it at the moment as well with, you know, the vaccinations order, where people are given a time frame to become vaccinated. We're not there where everyone has had the opportunity. We're very close to it. We would say, well, everyone should be fully vaccinated, say, within the next month to 6 weeks. And so testing is being used as a control measure in that interim period if people are working or returning to the office. I think we'll see a lot more than that. But then ongoing, as we are living with COVID, it may be that everyone on a weekly basis is required to produce negative tests. And then for your exceptions basis, if you've got unvaccinated workers you would have a different regime for them, whether that's vulnerable, high risk who can't be vaccinated, or people who are choosing not to and you're not requiring them or can't require them to be vaccinated, then you would, I think, be justified implementing a testing policy.
Okay. All right. Any other questions that we haven't answered from people? So if you've got any other questions, drop them into the chat box or the Q&A. There is a question around who pays for certain things like internet. I mean, this is really focused on health and safety. If people want to answer that question in the chat box, happy for you to chat between yourselves and share some of that information. But I don't think Olivia will probably know that answer. So, are there any other issues you foresee from a legal perspective that are likely to hit employers in the future around COVID or getting back to some sort of normality post-COVID?
Probably not ones that we haven't discussed already. My kind of take on it is there is a high kind of sense amongst business and industry that they actually want to mandate, not mandate, but want vaccination mandated by government or clearer rules and guidance around which roles need to be performed by vaccinated workers. And we're now starting to see some large corporates and organisations actually put a stake in the ground and actually require it. And sometimes it's not mandating vaccinations. You know, we're seeing now some people coming up with policies of no vax, no desk. And so that's not quite mandating the vaccine, but in effect it really is, because it's either you work from home, is that viable on a permanent basis, ongoing, to exclude them from the workplace. So I think that will be an issue that we grapple with, but my sense is that actually employers are starting to become a bit more confident and robust and are now requiring it more than they were at the start in terms of hesitancy.
Okay. There's one other question that's come through. Is it better to do a survey or not do a survey, because once you have the information you have to act on it?
Ignorance is bliss. I'm not sure. Look, we've found it hugely valuable. It's given us confidence to implement, or at least know how the policy might be perceived before we do it. So rather than going in the dark, you're required to anyway to consult and engage both under
so that's good
law, and under HASWA to do that. So I would strongly recommend it. I think probably the last tip that I would say is that there seems to be, and even amongst workers, this probably misconception that vaccination is the silver bullet, which it's not. People can still contract COVID when they're fully vaccinated. So I'm a little bit wary that organisations may be focused just on, let's get all our workforce fully vaccinated, but not actually looking long term. What other control measures do we need to put in place long term when we live with COVID around physical distancing, office design and layout? It might require, you know, different cleaning, hygiene requirements. So not forgetting that part of the piece as well.
Yeah. You may have answered this. Do we expect there will be further changes to legislation relating to the widening of mandatory vaccinations in the workplace? Or is that unknown question?
There's lots of gossip going around on that. I don't know. You know, I'm hearing chat that it might extend to the construction sector. Whether we go there or not, looking at how that went down in Australia, who knows? You know, Victoria has mandated vaccination for all workers, so everyone's taking a slightly different approach. I think probably the key takeouts that I've in evidence-based study is the best way is actually having informed workers who are not forced to do something, where they actually buy in and want to do it. So more focusing around on education, making sure that they have access to vaccinations, giving them time off, providing support to them if they need to do it. All of those sorts of things are probably the better approach before you get out the stick, so to speak. And I think that's probably in line with the government's approach to date. But if we have a high percentage rate we're aiming for, we might actually need mandatory orders to get there.
Yeah. One we've had here, is it permissible during the recruitment process to state the requirement of being vaccinated to be eligible to apply?
Yeah, so again, I think, well, quite a lot of organisations are requiring that. So as a term and condition of a new offer of employment, they need to be fully vaccinated. Again, whether that is lawful or not, we haven't had it tested, but I think it falls back to, well, actually asking that question, do you need to know for health and safety reasons? So is it required for health and safety reasons that that role that the person's applying for needs to be performed by a vaccinated worker? However, the rights of someone actually challenging that that situation by a prospective employer are very low. So it's much easier for a current employee to challenge actions versus a prospective employee. And the only grounds that they could challenge it would be under discrimination, so human rights grounds. So we're seeing quite a lot of people actually adding it as a condition of employment.
Okay. And we've got a question here. I'm not sure how to take this one, but if an employee has heavily encouraged employees to have a vaccination and that employee ends up with a vaccine injury, so I'm not sure whether it's the needle breaks when they're having a vaccination, does the employee need to provide additional support such as paid sick leave and or pay medical costs? So, I've never heard of a vaccine injury, but if I'm reading that correctly.
No, well, I think would they be covered by ACC in that situation anyway? Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. Okay, all right.
So I think that's all the questions I've got, unless anyone else has got any. Someone's asked about the webinar. So I think, Liz, you may be able to correct me. The recording will be available on the ShopCare website in the next few days, along with last week's one as well. So that hopefully answers your question. So yeah, I think that's all the questions I had.
Just a quick scan back up the chat function.
Yep. So no. So just to wrap up, and if anyone's got any last few questions, I'll take them. But so some of the key things I took out really, I think there's consulting with your workforce. I think it's a really good one just to give you a grounding for, you know, certainly how your people are feeling, and then giving you some evidence to back up what you do. So doing that first before you do your risk assessment. Obviously, carry out the risk assessment yourself if you feel able and capable to do that, or bring in a third party if you need that. I think the other things are, you know, obviously looking at controls. So if you've done your risk assessment, what do you do with that? So making sure that you've got various controls. And again, you can reach out to ShopCare. There'll be a number of, you know, Liz or one of the team will be able to share some of the controls that other businesses are using. There's going to be lots playing out on this over the next few weeks, I can imagine. And yeah, just making sure that I think you're looking after your people, and particularly the vulnerable people, making them feel. So I think one of the other issues with this is they feel that you're listening to them and they feel they're being cared for. So there is that aspect that you know, it's not just a big stick going, you know, coming down on people. The working from home, which we talked about earlier, is really about, you know, if you're mandating someone has to work from home, then there's more of a responsibility on you to pick up some of those costs and making sure they're set up to do the job safely. If it's an employee who chooses to work from home more and you're okay with that, then there's probably more of a burden lies with them in terms of picking up those costs. But either way, a risk assessment should be done so that you're aware of, you know, their workspace. And, you know, people have done that via getting them to just video around their workstation or sending pictures, so that they're aware of, you know, what the hazards are, helping them set their desk up and set their chairs up correctly. Because I think one of the long-term things will be back issues with poor setups. I've got my computer balanced on a bin, so it's at eye height. But I am getting a proper desk for Christmas from my wife, apparently. So so yeah, so it's I think that's quite important. So yeah, so I'd just like to thank Olivia for your time. Really appreciate your insights. It's been fantastic. And if you're able to share, someone asked about the survey questions. If you're able to share those in an email, we can share them with people. And obviously, if you're okay with sharing this risk assessment, we can make that available for people as well.
Yeah, that's fine.
So thank you. Liz, if you want to say anything.
No, look, just thanks, Olivia. Some great feedback in the chat function. Everyone found it very worthwhile and very timely. And that won't stop anytime soon. So thank you again for your time. Really appreciate it. And enjoy your freedoms in Wellington.
Yes, I am in the office, everyone, if you didn't pick that up. But feeling for everyone in Auckland. It's been a long slog. So look after yourself. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks.
See you.
Bye.